There are weapons that announce themselves with thunder and fire, and there are those that creep silently through the night like death itself. The Great War taught us that the most terrifying enemies are often the ones we cannot see coming. The invisible killers that turn the very air we breathe into poison, that transform the simple act of drawing breath from a life-giving necessity into a dance with death. Gas warfare didn't just kill bodies, it murdered souls, leaving survivors to carry the weight of invisible scars that would never heal. This is the story of men who faced an enemy that could not be shot, could not be bayoneted, could not be fought with courage alone. An enemy that lurked in every breeze and turned the morning mist into a harbinger of agony. Lieutenant James Crawford pressed his face against the cold periscope in the forward observation post, watching the dawn mist settle over no man's land like a shroud. April 22, 1915 had begun like countless other mornings on the Western Front. The usual exchange of sniper fire, the distant rumble of artillery, the rats scurrying between the wire. But something felt different today. The German trenches, usually alive with the subtle movements of an active defense, seemed eerily quiet. "Sir," Private Henderson whispered from beside him. The winds changed direction, blowing toward our lines now, steady from the northeast. James noted the observation in his field journal, though at the time it seemed like routine meteorological data. He had been in the trenches near Ypres for 3 months now, long enough to develop the veteran's instinct for detecting changes in the enemy's behavior. The Germans were planning something. He could feel it in the unnatural stillness that had settled over their positions. As a former chemistry lecturer at Cambridge, James had volunteered for service in August 1914 with the naive enthusiasm of a man who believed the war would be over by Christmas. The reality of trench warfare had stripped away those illusions with brutal efficiency, but his scientific training had proven valuable in ways he never expected. Understanding ballistics, analyzing soil composition for tunnel construction, even examining enemy equipment for tactical intelligence, his academic background had found practical applications in the mechanized slaughter of modern warfare. Crawford, Sergeant Mills, appeared at the observation post, his weathered face bearing the permanent tension that marked veteran NCOs. "Colonel wants to see you at headquarters. Says it's urgent." James made his way through the communication trenches, noting the familiar sounds and smells that had become the soundtrack of his life. The wet earth walls, reinforced with timber and sandbags, seemed to press closer each day. Men huddled in funk holes, carved into the trench sides, their faces bearing the hollow-eyed expression of soldiers who had seen too much death. The air reeked of cordite, unwashed bodies, and the sickly sweet stench of decomposition that no amount of lime could completely mask. Colonel Pemberton was studying a map when James entered the battalion command dugout, his expression troubled. Around him, staff officers maintained the controlled urgency that suggested something significant was developing. "Crawford, your scientific background makes you our resident expert on German innovations. We've received intelligence reports suggesting they may be preparing to use some form of chemical weapon. What's your assessment of such a possibility?" James considered the question carefully. He had heard rumors from other sectors about German experiments with irritant gases, tear gas shells that were more nuisance than threat. The Hague Convention prohibited the use of poison gas in warfare, but adherence to international law had become increasingly flexible as the war dragged on. "Sir, from a purely technical standpoint, the Germans have the industrial capacity to produce chemical weapons. Their dye industry is the most advanced in the world, and many of the same processes used to manufacture commercial chemicals could be adapted for military purposes. However, deployment would present significant logistical challenges, particularly regarding weather conditions and friendly fire concerns." Colonel Pemberton nodded grimly. "Intelligence suggests they've been installing what appear to be gas cylinders along their front line, particularly in sectors where the prevailing winds favor their positions. If they're planning a chemical attack, today's weather conditions would be ideal from their perspective. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of artillery fire began echoing across no man's land. But this wasn't the usual random harassment fire that characterized daily trench warfare. It was concentrated, systematic, targeting specific points along the Allied line with methodical precision. "Sir," a runner burst into the dugout, his face pale with excitement. "French positions to our north are reporting a strange yellow-green cloud moving toward their trenches. Their field telephone went dead mid-transmission." James felt his stomach turn cold. Yellow-green cloud. The color description matched chlorine gas, a chemical he knew well from his laboratory work. If the Germans were using chlorine as a weapon, the implications were staggering. "Colonel, if that's chlorine gas, we need to evacuate low-lying areas immediately. Chlorine is heavier than air. It will settle in trenches and shell holes, creating deadly concentrations that can persist for hours." The next few minutes passed in a blur of urgent activity. Orders were issued for all available men to move to higher ground, though the flat terrain around Ypres offered few truly safe positions. Gas masks were non-existent. The concept hadn't occurred to military planners who still thought of warfare in terms of bullets and shells. James found himself assigned to coordinate the evacuation of wounded from advanced positions, a task that would take him directly into the path of whatever chemical horror the Germans had unleashed. As he gathered a team of stretcher bearers and prepared to move forward, the first refugees from the gas attack began stumbling into their lines. They came like ghosts from a nightmare, French colonial soldiers who had faced the full brunt of the German chemical assault. Their faces were contorted with agony, eyes streaming tears that mixed with mucus and blood to create massive suffering that haunted James for the rest of his life. They gasped for breath like drowning men, their lungs seared by chlorine that had turned the moisture in their respiratory systems into hydrochloric acid. "Mon Dieu, help us!" one French corporal gasped in broken English, blood frothing from his mouth. "The gas, it burns everything. Cannot breathe, cannot see. Men are dying like poisoned rats in the trenches." James knelt beside the wounded soldier, his medical training telling him there was little that could be done. Chlorine poisoning attacked the entire respiratory system, causing fluid to accumulate in the lungs while simultaneously destroying the tissue that made breathing possible. It was a death sentence delivered with industrial efficiency. "Get these men to the casualty clearing station," James ordered his stretcher bearers, though he knew medical treatment would be largely useless. There was no antidote for chlorine poisoning, no cure for lungs that had been chemically burned beyond repair. As more refugees streamed past their positions, James began to understand the tactical situation developing to their north. The German gas attack had created a gap in the Allied line several miles wide, forcing two entire French divisions to abandon positions they had held for months. It was a breakthrough, more complete than anything achieved by conventional artillery bombardment. But what struck James most profoundly was the psychological impact of the gas attack on both Allied and German forces. The French colonial troops weren't just physically devastated, they were mentally shattered by encountering a form of warfare that violated every assumption about combat between civilized nations. These were veteran soldiers who had faced machine gun fire and artillery bombardment with stoic courage. But poison gas had reduced them to terrified, broken men who spoke of death creeping silently through the morning air. Crawford, Colonel Pemberton, appeared beside him as they watched the stream of gas casualties flow past their position. "I need you to lead a reconnaissance patrol into the affected area. We must understand the extent of German penetration and assess whether this gas cloud poses a continuing threat to our positions." It was a mission that violated every principle of military safety James had learned, but it was also a chance to observe firsthand the effects of chemical warfare and gather intelligence that might save lives in future attacks. James selected 6 volunteers for the patrol, men who understood they were walking into potentially lethal contamination, but were willing to accept the risk. They improvised protective equipment using water-soaked cloth over their faces, though James knew such measures would provide minimal protection against chlorine gas. The approach to the abandoned French positions led through terrain that had been transformed into an alien landscape. The grass and vegetation showed signs of chemical burning. Leaves yellowed and wilted as if touched by invisible fire. Bodies of men and animals lay scattered across the ground, their faces frozen in expressions of agony that spoke eloquently of their final moments. "Jesus Christ," Private Williams whispered, his voice muffled by the wet cloth covering his face. "What kind of weapon does this to a man?" James knelt beside one of the bodies, forcing himself to examine the evidence of chlorine poisoning with scientific detachment. The victim's face was blue-tinged from oxygen deprivation, his mouth and nose filled with the bloody froth that indicated pulmonary edema. It was a death that combined suffocation with chemical burning, probably lasting several agonizing minutes before unconsciousness provided merciful release. But what disturbed James most was the randomness of the casualties. Chlorine gas had killed indiscriminately veteran soldiers and young recruits, officers and enlisted men, even the animals that had been caught in the cloud's path. It was warfare that made no distinction between combatants and non-combatants, that killed based on wind direction rather than military necessity. The abandoned French trenches told a story of panic and desperate improvisation. Gas masks fashioned from handkerchiefs and urine-soaked rags lay scattered where men had torn them off in their final struggles for breath. Equipment had been abandoned in mid-use, suggesting that the attack had achieved complete tactical surprise. "Sir," Sergeant Mills called from an advanced position, "German patrols are moving through the gap. Looks like they're consolidating positions about half a mile beyond the original French line." James raised his binoculars, studying the German advance through the abandoned positions. What he saw was almost as disturbing as the gas casualties. German soldiers moving cautiously through terrain they had contaminated, wearing primitive protective equipment that consisted mainly of cloth masks soaked in chemical solutions. The Germans were clearly as unprepared for the aftermath of their chemical attack as the Allies had been for the attack itself. They advanced in small groups, testing the air and constantly checking their improvised protection. Several German soldiers could be seen lying motionless in areas where chlorine concentrations remained high, victims of their own weapon. "They're as scared of this stuff as we are," Williams observed, watching German soldiers probe abandoned French positions with obvious reluctance. It was a profound insight that would shape James's understanding of chemical warfare for the rest of the war. Poison gas was not just a weapon that killed enemies, it was a force that terrorized everyone on the battlefield, including those who deployed it. The wind could shift, concentrations could persist longer than expected, and protective equipment could fail at any moment. The patrol spent 3 hours in the contaminated area, gathering intelligence about German positions and assessing the continuing threat posed by residual gas concentrations. By the time they returned to British lines, James had reached several disturbing conclusions about the future of warfare. First, the German chlorine attack represented a fundamental change in military tactics. Chemical weapons could achieve breakthrough results that conventional artillery had failed to produce, but they also introduced unpredictable variables that made tactical planning enormously complex. Second, both sides were completely unprepared for chemical warfare from a medical and protective standpoint. The casualties James had witnessed would have been largely preventable with proper gas masks and training, but such equipment simply didn't exist. Third, the psychological impact of chemical weapons was perhaps more significant than their physical effects. Soldiers could steel themselves to face bullets and shells, but poison gas introduced an element of helpless terror that would fundamentally alter the character of trench warfare. Colonel Pemberton listened to James's report with growing concern, recognizing the implications for their own defensive preparations. "Crawford, I'm assigning you to work with divisional headquarters on developing countermeasures for future gas attacks. Your scientific background makes you uniquely qualified to understand both the technical and tactical aspects of this new threat." Over the following days, James found himself at the center of frantic efforts to prepare British forces for chemical warfare. Improvised gas masks were distributed, cotton pads soaked in sodium bicarbonate solution that provided minimal protection against chlorine. Training programs were hastily developed to teach soldiers how to recognize gas attacks and respond appropriately. But perhaps most significantly, James was tasked with analyzing captured German gas equipment and developing British chemical weapons capabilities. It was work that challenged his moral convictions as profoundly as it utilized his scientific expertise. The first German gas cylinders captured after the Ypres attack were surprisingly crude. Simple steel containers fitted with valves that released chlorine when opened. The system required favorable wind conditions and careful timing, but it could deliver massive concentrations of gas across a wide front with devastating effect. "Sir," James reported to the divisional staff, "the German gas attack system has significant limitations, but it also represents a major escalation in warfare capabilities. We need to develop both defensive measures and our own offensive chemical weapons if we're to maintain tactical parity." The decision to develop British chemical weapons was not made lightly, but military necessity overrode moral qualms. If the Germans were going to use poison gas, Allied forces needed the capability to retaliate in kind. James found himself working with chemists from universities across Britain, developing improved methods for producing and deploying chemical weapons. It was fascinating scientific work that happened to have horrific practical applications. The first British gas attack came in September 1915, using chlorine cylinders similar to the German systems. James was assigned as a technical observer, positioned to assess the effectiveness of their own chemical weapons and gather intelligence about German protective measures. Watching British soldiers prepare for the gas attack, James was struck by the transformation that had occurred in just a few months. Men who had been horrified by the German use of chemical weapons were now calmly preparing to deploy similar weapons against their enemies. War had a way of eroding moral distinctions, turning previously unthinkable actions into military necessities. 5 minutes to release, the gas officer announced, checking wind conditions one final time. James positioned himself with a clear view of both the British gas cylinders and the German trenches that would receive the chlorine cloud. He felt a mixture of scientific curiosity and moral revulsion, knowing that he was about to witness the deliberate poisoning of enemy soldiers. The gas release began at 0630 hours, with British soldiers opening valves on hundreds of chlorine cylinders positioned along a 2-mile front. The wind was favorable, carrying the yellow-green cloud steadily toward German positions at exactly the right speed to maintain lethal concentrations. Through his binoculars, James watched the gas cloud drift across no man's land like a living thing, flowing into shell holes and following the contours of the landscape with deadly persistence. When it reached the German trenches, he could see soldiers scrambling for protective equipment, some succeeding in donning primitive gas masks, while others were caught unprepared. The German response was immediate and panicked. Men fled from forward positions, abandoning equipment and weapons in their desperate attempt to escape the chlorine cloud. But others, either unable to retreat or determined to maintain their positions, remained in the trenches and faced the chemical assault with whatever protection they could improvise. James found himself counting casualties with the same detached precision he had once used to record experimental results in his Cambridge laboratory. Approximately 30 German soldiers appeared to be overcome by the gas, while perhaps 100 more were seen evacuating affected positions in obvious distress. But what struck him most powerfully was the silence that followed the gas attack. Unlike artillery bombardments, which produced dramatic explosions and immediate destruction, chemical weapons killed quietly. Men simply stopped moving, their struggles for breath becoming gradually weaker until they lay still in positions that suggested they had died trying to crawl away from the invisible killer. Attack successful, the gas officer reported with professional satisfaction. Estimate significant German casualties and complete evacuation of forward positions along targeted front. James nodded, making notes in his observation log, but his mind was grappling with the moral implications of what he had witnessed. He had just helped kill German soldiers using a method that violated every principle of civilized warfare he had been taught to respect. That evening, as James compiled his technical report on the gas attack's effectiveness, he received word that German forces had launched their own retaliatory chemical strike against Canadian positions further south. The cycle of chemical escalation was accelerating, with both sides developing more lethal gases and more efficient delivery systems. Private Henderson, who had been with James since the beginning of their service at Ypres, found him writing in his field journal by the light of a kerosene lamp. "Sir, what do you think this gas business means for how the war will end?" James looked up from his notes, considering a question that had been troubling him for weeks. "I think it means we've crossed a line that we can't uncross, Henderson. Once you start using chemical weapons, there's no going back to conventional warfare. Each side will keep developing more lethal gases until someone finds something so horrible that it forces a negotiated peace." "And what if nobody wants to negotiate, sir?" James returned to his writing, but Henderson's question echoed in his mind long after the private had returned to his duties. What if chemical warfare simply became another accepted tool of military strategy, like artillery or machine guns? What if future wars would be fought with increasingly sophisticated poisons until entire populations could be exterminated with industrial efficiency? The next morning brought news that would test James's darkest fears about the future of chemical warfare. German forces had begun using a new gas, phosgene, that was significantly more lethal than chlorine and much harder to detect. The first British casualties from phosgene exposure were already arriving at field hospitals, their symptoms suggesting a chemical weapon that could kill in concentrations far lower than anything previously encountered. James was ordered to investigate the new German gas and develop countermeasures as quickly as possible. It was an assignment that would take him deeper into the scientific complexities of chemical warfare and force him to confront the reality that poison gas was no longer an experimental weapon. It had become a permanent feature of modern combat. As he prepared to examine the first phosgene casualties, James reflected on how profoundly his understanding of warfare had changed since that April morning when German chlorine had first drifted across the French lines. He had entered the war as a Cambridge chemistry lecturer who believed in the civilizing influence of scientific progress. He was becoming something much more complex, a man who used his scientific knowledge to develop weapons of mass destruction while simultaneously trying to protect his own soldiers from similar weapons deployed by the enemy. The transformation troubled him, but it also seemed inevitable. In a war where survival depended on technological superiority, moral qualms were a luxury that soldiers could not afford. The Germans had introduced chemical warfare, and the Allies had no choice but to respond in kind or accept tactical defeat. But as James walked toward the casualty clearing station to examine the phosgene victims, he wondered whether the price of military necessity was becoming too high for civilization to bear. Chemical weapons didn't just kill soldiers. They corrupted the men who used them, turning scientists into poisoners and transforming the healing arts of chemistry into instruments of mass death. The war was entering a new phase, one where the air itself had become weaponized and every breath carried the potential for agony. James Crawford was about to discover that the evolution of chemical warfare was just beginning, and that the chlorine attack at Ypres had been merely the opening move in a deadly game of scientific escalation that would test the limits of human ingenuity and human conscience. The silent killer had found its voice, and it was screaming. The casualty clearing station had been transformed into a vision of hell that would haunt James Crawford for the rest of his life. Men lay on stretchers in neat rows, their breathing shallow and labored, their faces bearing expressions of confused terror as they struggled to understand what was happening to their bodies. Unlike chlorine victims who died quickly in obvious agony, phosgene casualties presented a more insidious horror. They looked almost normal at first glance, but were dying slowly from the inside out. "Sir," Captain Reynolds, the chief medical officer, approached James with undisguised desperation in his voice. "We've got 43 men who were exposed to this new German gas 12 hours ago. Most of them walked here under their own power, complaining of nothing more than a slight cough and the smell of fresh hay. Now they're drowning in their own body fluids." James knelt beside the nearest patient, Private Davies from the Welsh Regiment. The young soldier's lips had a bluish tinge, and pink froth bubbled at the corners of his mouth with each labored breath. But his eyes were alert and frightened, fully conscious of his deteriorating condition. "The gas, sir," Davies whispered, his voice barely audible. "We couldn't smell anything dangerous. Just like new-mown hay, it was. Beautiful morning scent, we thought. Then lads started coughing, but we figured it was just the usual trench dust." James felt his scientific mind cataloging symptoms while his human heart recoiled from the implications. Phosgene. He was certain now that's what the Germans had used. Carbonyl chloride, a compound he knew from industrial chemistry. At room temperature, it was a colorless gas with a deceptively pleasant odor, and it was roughly 10 times more lethal than chlorine. "How many men were in the affected area?" James asked Captain Reynolds. "Approximately 200 soldiers from 3 companies. They're arriving in waves as the symptoms develop. The bastards can't even tell they've been poisoned until their lungs start filling with fluid." James moved from patient to patient, documenting the progression of phosgene poisoning with clinical precision that helped him maintain emotional distance from the human tragedy unfolding before him. The gas attacked the alveoli, the tiny air sacs in the lungs where oxygen entered the bloodstream. It caused inflammation that led to massive fluid leakage, essentially drowning victims in their own blood plasma. "Sir," Private Henderson appeared at his elbow, having been assigned to assist with the medical investigation. "Colonel Pemberton needs your immediate assessment. German artillery has been targeting our aid stations, and there are reports of gas shell explosions in the forward positions." James felt his blood turn cold. If the Germans had perfected artillery delivery of phosgene, it meant chemical weapons had evolved from experimental curiosities to standard battlefield tools. No longer dependent on favorable wind conditions, they could deliver poison gas with the precision of conventional, high-explosive shells. "Reynolds, I need detailed records of symptom progression and time of exposure for every patient. We're going to see a lot more of this, and we need to understand how to treat it." "Treatment?" Reynolds laughed bitterly. "James, there is no treatment. We can give them morphine for the pain and oxygen to ease their breathing. But once the fluid starts accumulating in their lungs, they're going to die. It might take 6 hours or 18 hours, but they're going to die." The walk back to battalion headquarters took James through trenches that had been transformed by fear. Soldiers huddled in funk holes, constantly sniffing the air for traces of gas. Others compulsively checked the improvised protective equipment that had been hastily distributed. Cotton wool wrapped in muslin, soaked in various chemical solutions that might provide minimal protection against chlorine, but would be useless against phosgene. "Crawford," Colonel Pemberton looked up from a map covered with red marks. indicating suspected gas attacks. German artillery has been dropping gas shells for the past hour. Not the big cylinder attacks we've seen before, but precision targeting of command posts and communication trenches. James studied the pattern of attacks, noting the tactical sophistication of the German chemical warfare program. They were no longer using poison gas as an area denial weapon, but as surgical instruments to disable specific military targets. Sir, the new gas appears to be phosgene, delivered in artillery shells. It's significantly more lethal than chlorine and much harder to detect. Men can be exposed to fatal concentrations without realizing they're in danger until symptoms develop hours later. What kind of protective equipment do we need? James considered the question carefully. The improvised gas masks currently available to British troops were designed to filter chlorine, which was chemically reactive and could be absorbed by basic solutions. Phosgene was much more stable and would require sophisticated filtration systems that simply didn't exist. Sir, effective protection against phosgene requires activated charcoal filters and airtight seals around the face. The equipment we currently have might provide psychological comfort, but it won't save lives. Colonel Pemberton absorbed this information with visible frustration. How long before we can get proper equipment? Weeks, possibly months. This is an industrial problem that requires factory production of completely new equipment designs. The conversation was interrupted by the distinctive whistle of incoming artillery, followed by explosions that sounded different from conventional high-explosive shells. Instead of the sharp crack of TNT, these produced muffled pops that scattered small fragments over a wide area. Gas shells, James said, grabbing his field glasses and moving to the observation slit. Through the narrow opening, he could see yellowish vapor rising from the impact sites, dispersing in the afternoon breeze with deadly efficiency. "All personnel, gas alert!" Colonel Pemberton shouted, though they all knew their protective measures were inadequate. Men scrambled for their improvised masks, covering their faces with cloth that had been soaked in various chemical solutions. James found himself studying the gas attack with scientific fascination, even as he struggled with his own improvised protection. The German shells had been precisely targeted to bracket their command position, creating an inescapable zone of contamination. It was chemical warfare used with tactical precision rather than strategic terror. The next few hours passed in a nightmare of organized chaos. Men began showing symptoms of phosgene exposure in waves, arriving at aid stations with the distinctive pink froth that indicated pulmonary edema. But unlike earlier gas attacks, many of the victims had no idea they had been poisoned until their symptoms became severe. "Sir," Sergeant Mills appeared at the command post, his face pale with something beyond normal battlefield fear. "We've lost contact with A Company. Last message said they were under gas attack. Then the telephone line went dead." James volunteered to lead a reconnaissance patrol to A Company's positions, using his scientific background to assess the continuing danger from residual gas contamination. It was a mission that would take him directly into areas where phosgene concentrations might still be lethal. The patrol consisted of 6 men, all volunteers who understood they were walking into potentially fatal contamination. They wore the best protective equipment available, cotton masks soaked in sodium carbonate solution, but James knew such protection was largely psychological. The approach to A Company's trenches revealed the tactical effectiveness of phosgene as a weapon. Unlike chlorine, which announced its presence with visible clouds and immediate symptoms, phosgene had killed silently and invisibly. Men lay in their positions apparently undisturbed, many still holding weapons or caught in routine activities. "Jesus," Private Williams whispered, his voice muffled by his improvised mask. "They don't look like they suffered much." James knelt beside one of the bodies, forcing himself to examine the evidence with scientific detachment. The victim showed classic signs of phosgene poisoning: blue-tinged lips, pink froth around the mouth, but peaceful facial expression. Death had come gradually as fluid accumulated in the lungs, causing unconsciousness before the final suffocation. "Sir," Henderson called from a nearby position, "I found 3 men still alive, but they're in bad shape." The survivors were in the advanced stages of phosgene poisoning, conscious but breathing with obvious difficulty. They had been exposed to lower concentrations of gas and were dying more slowly than their comrades. "Help us, sir," one of them gasped, recognizing James's officer insignia. "Can't breathe proper. Feels like drowning, it does." James felt the familiar weight of helplessness that accompanied chemical casualties. There was nothing he could do except provide comfort and record symptoms for future intelligence purposes. These men were going to die, and all the medical knowledge in the world couldn't save them. The evacuation of A Company's survivors took 3 hours, with James's patrol carrying stretchers across terrain that might still contain dangerous gas concentrations. By the time they reached medical facilities, 2 of the 3 survivors had died, drowning in their own fluids despite every effort to keep their airways clear. That evening, as James compiled his report on the phosgene attack, he received orders that would fundamentally change his role in the war. He was being transferred to a special unit dedicated to developing British chemical weapons capabilities and countermeasures against German gas attacks. Crawford, Major Blackwood, from Divisional Intelligence, explained during their briefing, "Your scientific background and field experience with German chemical weapons make you uniquely qualified for this assignment. We're establishing a new facility dedicated to chemical warfare research, and we need officers who understand both the technical and tactical aspects of poison gas." The assignment would take James away from frontline service and into the industrial complexes where Britain was desperately trying to match German chemical weapons capabilities. It was an opportunity to contribute to the war effort in ways that matched his scientific training, but it also meant leaving behind the soldiers whose trust he had earned through shared danger. "Sir, what kind of work will be involved?" "Development of British gas weapons, improvement of protective equipment, and analysis of German chemical warfare techniques. You'll be working with some of the finest chemists in the Empire, but you'll also be responsible for field testing new weapons and equipment." James accepted the assignment with mixed feelings. Part of him was eager to apply his scientific knowledge to problems that might save British lives and shorten the war. But another part recognized that he was being asked to become a professional poisoner, a man whose expertise would be used to develop increasingly lethal chemical weapons. The journey to the new chemical warfare facility took James through English countryside that seemed impossibly peaceful compared to the hell he had left behind in France. Fields of grain waved in summer breezes that carried no hint of poison, and farmers worked their land without fear of gas shells falling from clear skies. The facility itself was a converted manufacturing complex that had been rapidly expanded to accommodate the urgent demands of chemical weapons research. Laboratories filled with sophisticated equipment shared space with production lines where gas masks were being manufactured by the thousands. Crawford, Dr. Pemberton, the facility's scientific director, greeted him with the enthusiasm of a man who had found the perfect colleague. "Your field reports on German gas attacks have been invaluable for our research. We need someone who can bridge the gap between laboratory theory and battlefield reality." The next few weeks immersed James in the cutting-edge science of chemical warfare. British chemists had developed their own version of phosgene, along with delivery systems that could match German artillery capabilities. They were also experimenting with more exotic compounds, gases that could penetrate existing protective equipment and cause casualties even among prepared troops. But what struck James most profoundly was the enthusiasm with which civilian scientists had embraced chemical warfare research. Men who had spent their careers developing industrial processes or academic theories were now applying their expertise to creating weapons of mass destruction with apparent relish. The Germans may have started this chemical warfare business, Dr. Pemberton explained during one laboratory session, but we're going to finish it. British chemical industry has capabilities they never imagined, and we're developing gases that will make their Phosgene look like a children's toy. James found himself torn between admiration for the scientific ingenuity being displayed and horror at its applications. The laboratory where he worked was producing knowledge that could revolutionize industrial chemistry, but it was also creating weapons that would kill thousands of men in ways that violated every principle of civilized warfare. The first test of British-manufactured Phosgene came in October 1915, with James serving as technical observer for the artillery attack on German positions near Loos. It was his first experience watching chemical weapons being deployed by his own side, and it challenged his understanding of military necessity versus moral responsibility. The British gas shells were fired in a precisely coordinated barrage designed to saturate German trenches with lethal concentrations of Phosgene. James watched through binoculars as the shells burst in white puffs that quickly dispersed into invisible death clouds drifting toward enemy positions. Excellent targeting, the artillery observer noted with professional satisfaction. Good concentration over the target area, minimal drift toward our own positions. James found himself counting German casualties with the same scientific detachment he had once applied to laboratory experiments. Through his binoculars, he could see enemy soldiers evacuating affected positions, many showing the distinctive signs of gas poisoning. Others remained motionless in their trenches, victims of chemical weapons that British laboratories had perfected. Estimated 40 to 60 German casualties, he reported to divisional headquarters. Effective neutralization of defensive positions along targeted front. But that night, alone in his quarters, James struggled with the moral implications of what he had helped accomplish. He had used his scientific expertise to develop weapons that killed men in particularly horrible ways, and he had done so with efficiency that would have impressed his former colleagues at Cambridge. The next morning brought news that would test his convictions even further. German forces had retaliated with their own chemical attack, using a new gas that penetrated existing British protective equipment and caused casualties among troops who believed they were adequately protected. We need immediate analysis of this new German compound, Dr. Pemberton explained as James prepared to return to France. Field samples, casualty reports, and tactical assessment of their deployment methods. This is chemical warfare evolving in real time, and we must stay ahead of their innovations. James found himself back in the trenches within a week, but now his role had fundamentally changed. He was no longer just an officer trying to keep his men alive. He was a scientific intelligence agent whose mission was to gather technical data about enemy chemical weapons so that British laboratories could develop even more lethal countermeasures. The new German gas proved to be chloropicrin, a compound that caused severe irritation and forced soldiers to remove their gas masks even in contaminated areas. It was a diabolically clever weapon that turned protective equipment into a liability, exposing men to other gases that might be mixed with the chloropicrin. Cunning bastards, Sergeant Mills observed, as they examined gas mask equipment abandoned by troops who had been forced to tear off their protection. They've figured out how to make our own safety gear work against us. James collected samples of residual gas for laboratory analysis, working with scientific precision, even as he was surrounded by evidence of chemical weapons' human cost. Bodies of British soldiers lay in positions that showed they had died trying to escape from their own protective equipment, poisoned by the very measures designed to save their lives. The technical data he gathered would be used to develop British countermeasures, which would in turn prompt German scientists to create even more sophisticated chemical weapons. It was an arms race being conducted by university-educated men who applied the methods of scientific research to the problem of killing enemy soldiers as efficiently as possible. By winter 1915, chemical warfare had become a routine feature of trench warfare on the Western Front. Both sides regularly used gas shells as part of conventional artillery barrages, and soldiers had learned to live with the constant threat of invisible death that could arrive without warning on any shift of wind. James found himself at the center of this chemical arms race, traveling between frontline positions and laboratory facilities, gathering intelligence about enemy innovations and supervising tests of British chemical weapons. It was work that utilized his scientific training in ways he had never imagined when he volunteered for military service. But what disturbed him most was how quickly both soldiers and scientists had adapted to chemical warfare as a normal part of military operations. Men who had been horrified by the first German chlorine attack now routinely handled gas shells and wore protective equipment as naturally as they carried rifles and wore helmets. Crawford, Colonel Pemberton briefed him on his latest assignment. "We're developing a new type of chemical weapon that should render German gas masks completely ineffective. We need field trials to determine optimal deployment methods and casualty estimates." James accepted the assignment, knowing that his scientific expertise was contributing to an escalating spiral of chemical warfare that seemed to have no logical endpoint. Each new weapon prompted countermeasures that led to even more lethal compounds being developed by both sides. As 1916 began, James received intelligence reports that would challenge everything he thought he understood about the limits of chemical warfare. German laboratories were reportedly developing a completely new category of chemical weapon, one that attacked through skin contact rather than inhalation, making gas masks useless and creating casualties that defied all existing medical treatment. The age of mustard gas was about to begin, and James Crawford was about to discover that the horrors of chemical warfare had only just begun. The silent killer was evolving, and its next manifestation would test the limits of human endurance and scientific ingenuity in ways that would make phosgene seem like a mercy by comparison. But first, he would face a crisis that would force him to choose between his scientific objectivity and his human conscience. A moment when the abstract pursuit of chemical warfare supremacy would collide with the reality of what such weapons did to individual human beings who happened to be wearing the wrong uniform. The laboratory had become his new battlefield, but the war being fought there would prove even more morally complex than anything he had experienced in the trenches of the Western Front. The laboratory explosion shattered the morning calm of March 1917, sending a plume of yellowish smoke billowing across the experimental facility near Porton Down. Lieutenant James Crawford threw himself behind a concrete blast wall as fragments of glass and metal rained down around him, his scientific instincts immediately cataloging the acrid smell that burned his nostrils, a mixture of garlic and horseradish that he would remember for the rest of his life. "Gas! Gas! Everyone out!" Dr. Pemberton's voice cracked with panic as he scrambled from the destroyed laboratory, his face already showing the telltale redness that indicated chemical burns. Behind him, two research assistants stumbled through the smoke, their eyes streaming tears as they gasped for breath in the contaminated air. James pulled his improvised respirator over his face and rushed toward the accident site, his mind racing through the chemical processes they had been testing. The experimental compound, dichlorodethyl sulfide, which the German prisoners had cryptically referred to as Weiperite or Hun stuff, had proven far more volatile than their initial analysis suggested. "Get everyone to the decontamination stations," James shouted to the facility guards who were standing in confused clusters, unsure whether to approach the burning laboratory or evacuate the area entirely. "Strip off all clothing and wash thoroughly with bleach solution. This is not like chlorine or phosgene. It attacks through the skin." The next few hours would forever change James's understanding of chemical warfare's true horror. Unlike the relatively quick death delivered by pulmonary agents like phosgene, this new German compound, which British chemists had dubbed mustard gas for its distinctive color and odor, was designed to inflict maximum suffering over extended periods. Dr. Pemberton, despite immediate decontamination procedures, began showing symptoms within hours of exposure. His skin developed angry red welts wherever the chemical had made contact, and his eyes swelled shut as blisters formed on his eyelids. By evening, he was delirious with pain, begging for morphine to ease an agony that seemed to penetrate to his very bones. "James," Pemberton gasped from his hospital bed, his voice barely audible through throat tissues that had been chemically burned. "This compound, it's not designed to kill quickly. It's designed to create casualties that consume medical resources while terrorizing everyone who witnesses the suffering." James sat beside his colleague's bedside, forcing himself to document symptoms with scientific precision while his human heart recoiled from the evidence of chemical warfare's evolution. Mustard gas represented a fundamental shift in military thinking, from weapons that killed efficiently to those that tortured systematically. The accident had occurred during attempts to reverse engineer German mustard gas from shell fragments captured during recent attacks on Canadian positions near Ypres. Intelligence reports suggested the Germans had perfected both the manufacture and delivery of this new chemical weapon, using it with devastating effect against Allied forces who believed their improved gas masks provided adequate protection. "Sir," Captain Reynolds from the Medical Corps entered with the latest casualty reports from France, "we're receiving increasing numbers of mustard gas victims from the Western Front. The symptoms are unprecedented in their severity and duration." James reviewed the medical files with growing dread, noting patterns that confirmed his worst fears about chemical warfare's trajectory. Mustard gas didn't just kill. It maimed in ways that made death seem merciful by comparison. Soldiers exposed to moderate concentrations survived the initial attack only to endure weeks or months of agony as their skin and respiratory systems slowly dissolved under the chemical's relentless assault. "Look at this case." Reynolds pointed to a photograph that James wished he could forget. "Private Morrison, Canadian Corps, exposed to mustard gas 3 weeks ago. The chemical burns cover 60% of his body surface, and his lungs are essentially destroyed. He's conscious, aware of everything that's happening to him, and there's nothing we can do except provide morphine until he dies." The photograph showed a young man whose face had been transformed into a mass of weeping sores, his eyes sealed shut by chemical burns that had penetrated beneath the skin to attack underlying tissues. It was an image that would haunt James's dreams for decades, a reminder of what scientific expertise applied to military purposes could accomplish. How many similar cases are we seeing? Approximately 300 per week, and the numbers are increasing as German forces expand their use of mustard gas. The psychological impact on medical personnel is becoming as significant as the drain on resources. Nurses are requesting transfers rather than continue treating these patients. James understood their reluctance. Mustard gas casualties challenged every instinct of medical professionals trained to heal and comfort. The wounds were so severe, the suffering so prolonged, and the prognosis so hopeless that treatment became an exercise in managing dying rather than preserving life. But what disturbed James most profoundly was the enthusiasm with which British military leaders had embraced the development of their own mustard gas capabilities. Within days of the Porton Down accident, he received orders to accelerate production of British chemical weapons based on captured German formulations. Crawford, Major Blackwood, briefed him on the new priorities. "German mustard gas attacks are creating unacceptable casualties among our forces. We need British production capabilities operational within 6 weeks, with sufficient stockpiles to launch retaliatory attacks by summer. Sir, the safety protocols for manufacturing mustard gas are extremely complex. The compound is persistent, meaning it contaminates everything it contacts for days or weeks. Production workers will face enormous risk, and any industrial accident could create civilian casualties. That's a risk we're prepared to accept. German scientists didn't develop this weapon to leave it unused, and we cannot allow them to maintain chemical superiority. The industrial complex chosen for mustard gas production was located in a rural area of Yorkshire, far enough from major population centers to contain potential accidents, but close enough to transportation networks for efficient distribution to the front lines. James found himself overseeing the conversion of a textile factory into a chemical weapons manufacturing facility, applying his scientific knowledge to problems that would have been unimaginable during his peaceful years at Cambridge. The first British mustard gas was produced in May 1917, under security conditions so strict that workers were not told what they were manufacturing. James watched the production process with fascination and revulsion, seeing industrial chemistry techniques he had taught to undergraduate students being used to create weapons of mass destruction. "Magnificent work, Crawford," General Folks, the British commander responsible for chemical warfare, inspected the yellow-brown liquid that filled steel artillery shells. "This gives us the capability to match anything the Germans can deploy." James nodded appropriately, though privately he wondered whether matching German atrocities represented progress or moral surrender. The mustard gas shells looked innocuous enough. Standard artillery rounds painted with identifying marks that indicated their chemical payloads. But he knew their contents could create suffering that defied human comprehension. The first British mustard gas attack came in July 1917, during preparations for the Passchendaele offensive. James was assigned as technical observer, positioned to assess the effectiveness of British chemical weapons and gather intelligence about German protective measures. Standing in the pre-dawn darkness of a forward observation post, James watched British artillery crews prepare for the gas bombardment with professional efficiency that had become routine over 2 years of chemical warfare. The shells were handled like any other ammunition, though James noticed the crews wore protective equipment and maintained careful distances from the chemical munitions. Target area saturated with approximately 2,000 mustard gas shells, the artillery commander reported as the bombardment began. Wind conditions favorable for persistent contamination of German positions. Through his binoculars, James observed the shell bursts across German lines. Small puffs of yellowish vapor that dissipated quickly, but left behind liquid droplets that would remain lethal for days or weeks. Unlike the dramatic clouds produced by chlorine or phosgene attacks, mustard gas worked silently and invisibly, contaminating everything it touched with patient malevolence. The German response was immediate but confused. Soldiers could be seen evacuating some positions while reinforcing others, apparently uncertain about the extent of contamination. Gas masks were distributed hastily, though James knew such protection would prove inadequate against a chemical weapon designed to attack through skin contact. Estimated 300 to 400 German casualties expected over next 48 hours, James reported to Divisional Headquarters. Contamination should persist for approximately 1 week, denying enemy use of affected positions. But that evening, alone in his quarters, James struggled with the moral implications of what he had helped accomplish. Unlike previous gas attacks that killed quickly and allowed some possibility of medical intervention, mustard gas created casualties that would suffer for weeks before dying in agony that morphine could barely touch. The next morning brought news that would test his convictions even further. German forces had retaliated with their own mustard gas attack against British positions, using concentrations that exceeded anything previously deployed. The casualties were arriving at field hospitals in numbers that overwhelmed medical facilities. Crawford, Captain Reynolds, met him at the casualty clearing station with desperation in his voice. "We've got over 200 mustard gas cases from last night's German attack. The symptoms are more severe than anything we've seen before. They must be using higher concentrations or improved formulations. James forced himself to examine the casualties, documenting symptoms for intelligence purposes while trying to maintain scientific objectivity. The victims were almost unrecognizable as human beings, their faces swollen beyond recognition, their bodies covered with blisters that wept yellow fluid, their voices reduced to agonized whispers as chemical burns destroyed their throat tissues. "Please, sir," one victim gasped, reaching toward James with hands that had been transformed into masses of raw flesh. "Make it stop. Whatever they did to us, make it stop." James knelt beside the dying soldier, knowing there was nothing medical science could offer except palliative care. The chemical burns were so extensive that healing was impossible, and the respiratory damage ensured death within days or weeks. It was warfare that violated every principle of human decency James had been taught to respect. "We'll do everything possible to ease your pain," James promised, though he knew everything possible was pitifully inadequate against the systematic torture inflicted by mustard gas. As he moved between casualties, James began to understand the strategic logic behind mustard gas deployment. Each victim required intensive medical care that consumed resources and personnel far beyond what a quick death would demand. The psychological impact on medical staff and nearby soldiers was equally significant, creating fear that extended far beyond the immediate casualties. But what struck him most powerfully was the randomness of the suffering. Mustard gas made no distinction between veteran soldiers and new recruits, between officers and enlisted men, between the brave and the cowardly. It killed and maimed based on wind direction and shell placement rather than military necessity or individual choice. Over the following weeks, as the Battle of Passchendaele developed into the bloodiest campaign of the war, James found himself at the center of an escalating chemical arms race. Both sides deployed mustard gas with increasing frequency, creating vast areas of contaminated terrain that remained lethal long after conventional artillery bombardments ended. The entire Ypres salient is becoming chemically uninhabitable, James reported to General Folks during a strategic planning session. Mustard gas contamination persists for weeks, making it impossible for either side to occupy affected positions without suffering continuous casualties. "Then we need to develop compounds that are even more persistent and more lethal," General Folks replied, with the single-minded focus that characterized professional military thinking. "German chemical warfare capabilities are improving faster than ours. We must accelerate research into new agents." James returned to his laboratory work with growing sense of moral crisis. His scientific expertise was being used to develop increasingly horrific weapons, yet military necessity seemed to demand continued escalation. German chemists were reportedly experimenting with compounds that could penetrate existing protective equipment, while British researchers worked frantically to maintain tactical parity. The breakthrough came in September 1917 when German prisoners revealed information about a new chemical weapon that would make mustard gas seem merciful by comparison. The compound, provisionally designated lewisite by British intelligence, was an arsenic-based agent that combined the blistering effects of mustard gas with systemic poisoning that attacked the nervous system and vital organs. If this intelligence is accurate, Dr. Morrison, Pemberton's replacement as scientific director, briefed James on the implications. "The Germans are developing chemical weapons that could render entire armies combat ineffective within hours of exposure. We need British countermeasures immediately." James found himself leading a research team dedicated to developing British versions of lewisite, working with compounds so dangerous that laboratory accidents could kill researchers instantly. It was scientific work at the highest level, but applied to purposes that challenged his fundamental beliefs about human civilization. The moral complexity of his situation was highlighted during a chance encounter with a group of German prisoners who had been captured during recent fighting around Passchendaele. Among them was Dr. Heinrich Klausmann, a chemistry professor from Munich who had been conscripted into German chemical warfare research. Herr Crawford, Klausmann spoke in excellent English during their brief conversation. I know your reputation from scientific journals we captured. You were studying organometallic compounds before the war, were you not? Yes, though that research seems very distant now. As does mine. I was investigating industrial applications of arsenic compounds for textile manufacturing. Now I find myself designing weapons to poison enemy soldiers with the same chemical processes. This war has turned us all into people we never intended to become. James was struck by Klausmann's observation. The German chemist was essentially his mirror image, a university researcher whose scientific expertise had been pressed into service for mass destruction. Both men understood the terrible irony of using advanced chemistry to create increasingly sophisticated methods of human suffering. Do you believe there are limits to what scientists should develop for military use? James asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Klausmann was silent for a long moment before responding. I believed there were limits before I saw what this war demands of civilized nations. Now I think scientists will continue developing more lethal weapons until someone creates something so horrible that it forces political leaders to end the fighting. And what if they don't? What if chemical weapons simply become another accepted tool of warfare? Then future wars will be fought with increasingly sophisticated poisons until entire populations can be exterminated with industrial efficiency. We are creating knowledge that could destroy civilization itself. The conversation haunted James as he returned to his research. Klausmann's prediction about escalating chemical warfare seemed increasingly plausible, as both sides developed more lethal compounds and more efficient delivery systems. The war that had begun with conventional weapons was becoming a contest between industrial chemists working to perfect methods of mass poisoning. By winter 1917, chemical warfare had fundamentally altered the character of fighting on the Western Front. Soldiers lived in constant fear of invisible death that could arrive without warning on any shift of wind. Medical facilities were overwhelmed with casualties who suffered for weeks before dying in agony that contemporary medicine could not relieve. But perhaps most significantly, chemical weapons had corrupted the men who developed and deployed them. James found himself calculating casualty estimates with the same professional detachment he had once applied to academic research, viewing human suffering as statistical data rather than individual tragedy. Sir, Private Henderson, who had somehow survived 2 years of frontline service and been assigned to assist with James's intelligence work, approached him with obvious reluctance. I've been thinking about what we're doing here, and I'm not sure I can continue. James looked up from the chemical analysis he was conducting, noting Henderson's expression of moral distress. What specifically troubles you, Private? It's the gas casualties, sir. I've watched men die from bullets and shells, and that's horrible enough. But these chemical weapons, they turn dying into torture that can last for weeks. It feels like we're becoming monsters ourselves. Henderson's observation forced James to confront questions he had been avoiding. Had the scientific pursuit of military advantage transformed him into something fundamentally different from the Cambridge lecturer who had volunteered for service in 1914? Was there a point where military necessity became indistinguishable from moral surrender? Henderson, what would you have us do? The Germans are developing these weapons whether we respond or not. If we don't maintain chemical parity, they could use poison gas to achieve decisive tactical advantage. I understand the logic, sir, but I wonder whether some victories are too expensive to be worth winning. If we have to become like our enemies to defeat them, what exactly have we accomplished? James had no answer to Henderson's question, though it would trouble him for the rest of the war and beyond. The development of chemical weapons had created a spiral of escalation that seemed to have no logical endpoint, with each side developing more lethal compounds to counter the previous innovations of their enemies. As 1918 approached, intelligence reports suggested that German chemical warfare capabilities were reaching unprecedented levels of sophistication. New compounds that could penetrate any existing protective equipment were reportedly in production, while delivery systems were being perfected that could saturate entire battlefield sectors with lethal concentrations of multiple gases. But James was also aware that British chemical warfare research had achieved similar advances. Laboratories across England were producing compounds that exceeded German capabilities in both lethality and persistence, while artillery specialists were developing delivery systems that could deploy multiple chemical agents with devastating precision. The stage was set for a final phase of chemical warfare that would test the limits of human endurance and scientific ingenuity. Both sides possessed weapons that could poison entire armies, but neither could predict how the other would respond to ultimate escalation. James Crawford, the former literature enthusiast who had volunteered to serve his country, found himself at the center of developments that could determine whether chemical warfare would end with the current conflict or become a permanent feature of human warfare. The decisions he made in his laboratory, the weapons he helped perfect, and the intelligence he gathered could influence the fate of millions of people who would never know his name. But as he prepared for what might be the final and most deadly phase of chemical warfare, James was haunted by Dr. Klausmann's prediction about the consequences of unlimited scientific escalation. Perhaps they were indeed creating knowledge that could destroy civilization itself, and perhaps the only question that mattered was whether they would recognize the danger before it was too late. The silent killer had evolved far beyond anything its original creators had imagined, and its next manifestation would challenge every assumption about the limits of human cruelty and scientific ingenuity. The war was entering its final phase, but the weapons being prepared for that climax would cast shadows across decades of future conflict. James was about to discover that some victories exact a price that makes defeat seem preferable, and that the pursuit of military advantage could lead to discoveries that would haunt humanity long after the guns finally fell silent. The laboratory at Porton Down had become James Crawford's cathedral of scientific blasphemy, its sterile corridors echoing with the footsteps of men who had dedicated themselves to perfecting methods of human destruction. As spring 1918 brought news of Germany's massive offensive on the Western Front, James found himself working 18-hour days to complete development of what military planners called the war-winning weapon, a compound so lethal that a single artillery bombardment could render entire Army Corps combat ineffective within minutes. Crawford, General Folks, entered the main laboratory accompanied by a delegation of senior staff officers, their faces bearing expressions of grim determination. German forces are using chemical weapons in unprecedented concentrations during their spring offensive. Intelligence reports suggest they're deploying gas shells comprising 50% of their total ammunition expenditure. James looked up from the complex apparatus he was using to synthesize lewisite, noting the irony of his situation. While German armies advanced toward Paris using industrial quantities of poison gas, he was working frantically to perfect British chemical weapons that might never see combat if the war ended before production was complete. Sir, our lewisite production should be operational within 6 weeks. Initial tests suggest it's significantly more lethal than mustard gas, with the additional advantage of rapid onset symptoms that prevent enemy forces from seeking medical treatment. 6 weeks may be too late, General Folkes replied grimly. German forces have broken through British lines at multiple points, and their gas attacks are creating casualties faster than our medical facilities can process them. We need immediate solutions. The urgency in the general's voice reflected the desperation that had gripped Allied command as German forces approached within artillery range of Paris. Chemical weapons had become the deciding factor in the war's final phase, with both sides deploying poison gas with an intensity that dwarfed all previous uses. James returned to his laboratory work with renewed focus, synthesizing compounds that represented the culmination of 3 years' experience with chemical warfare. The Lewisite he was producing would be delivered in artillery shells designed to create persistent contamination over areas measured in square miles rather than yards, essentially making vast regions uninhabitable for weeks or months. "Sir," Captain Reynolds appeared at his laboratory door, his medical officer's uniform bearing stains that James preferred not to identify. "We've received the latest casualty reports from France. Gas casualties are arriving at a rate of over 1,000 per day, and most medical facilities are refusing to accept additional chemical weapons patients." James felt a familiar tightness in his chest as he processed the implications. After 3 years of escalating chemical warfare, Allied medical capabilities were simply being overwhelmed by the sheer volume of poison gas casualties. Hospitals designed to treat conventional battle wounds were being forced to become warehouses for men dying slowly from chemical burns and respiratory damage. What's the current mortality rate for gas casualties? Approximately 70% for mustard gas exposures, over 90% for the new compounds the Germans are using. But the ones who survive, James, they're no longer recognizable as human beings. We have wards full of men whose faces have been destroyed by chemical burns, who will spend the rest of their lives blind and disfigured, assuming they live long enough to be discharged. James nodded absently, adding Reynolds' statistics to the mental calculation he had been maintaining throughout his involvement in chemical weapons development. By his estimates, chemical weapons had killed or permanently disabled over 200,000 men since that first chlorine attack at Ypres 3 years earlier. Each innovation in gas warfare had multiplied the casualty rates, creating suffering on a scale that defied comprehension. "There's something else," Reynolds continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "We've started receiving reports of civilian gas casualties in areas near the front lines. German long-range artillery is targeting cities with chemical weapons, apparently trying to create panic behind Allied lines." The news struck James like a physical blow. Chemical weapons targeting civilian populations represented a line that even the most desperate military commanders had previously hesitated to cross. If poison gas was being used against non-combatants, the boundaries between warfare and mass murder were dissolving completely. That evening, James found himself walking through the deserted corridors of the Porton Down facility, unable to concentrate on his research as he grappled with the moral implications of his work. For 3 years, he had justified his involvement in chemical weapons development by invoking military necessity and national survival. But the reports of civilian casualties forced him to confront a fundamental question about the price of victory. He paused in front of a laboratory where technicians were loading Lewisite into artillery shells, watching men handle compounds that could kill thousands with the casual efficiency of factory workers. The scene crystallized his growing sense that scientific progress applied to warfare had created capabilities that exceeded human wisdom to control them. "James," Dr. Pemberton's voice interrupted his thoughts. Pemberton had recovered from his chemical burns, but bore permanent scars that served as daily reminders of the dangers they worked with. "I thought I might find you here. Trouble sleeping again?" "I've been thinking about what we've accomplished here, about the weapons we've created and the casualties they've caused. Sometimes I wonder whether we've crossed lines that civilized nations should never cross." Pemberton studied James's face in the dim corridor's lighting, recognizing the moral crisis that had been building for months. "James, what we do here is unpleasant, but it's necessary. The Germans started this chemical warfare business, and we have no choice but to respond. Do we? What if we simply refused to develop these weapons? What if we decided that some methods of warfare are too horrible to employ, regardless of military advantage? Then German forces would use poison gas to achieve decisive victory, and British soldiers would die in numbers that make current casualties seem insignificant. You're thinking like a peacetime academic rather than a military officer facing an existential threat to his nation. James understood Pemberton's logic, but he was no longer certain that military logic provided adequate justification for the weapons they had created. Chemical warfare had evolved beyond tactical necessity into systematic torture applied on an industrial scale. The conversation was interrupted by a messenger bearing urgent orders from General Headquarters. James was being recalled to France immediately to oversee deployment of the first British Lewisite shells, which had been rushed into production despite incomplete testing. Crawford, the orders read, German forces are preparing final assault on Allied positions using unprecedented concentrations of chemical weapons. British Lewisite must be deployed immediately to counter German chemical superiority. Report to artillery headquarters near Amiens for coordination of gas bombardment targeting German reserve positions. The journey back to France took James through countryside that had been transformed by 3 years of chemical warfare. Vast areas remained uninhabitable due to persistent gas contamination, their yellow warning signs marking zones where poison still lingered in soil and water. Villages that had been evacuated after gas attacks stood empty, their windows staring blindly across landscapes that seemed to have been touched by industrial death. The artillery headquarters near Amiens presented a scene of organized desperation as Allied forces prepared for what many believed would be the final battle of the war. Chemical weapons had become central to military planning, with gas shells comprising the majority of ammunition stockpiles and specialized units trained in nothing but the deployment of poison compounds. Crawford, Colonel Morrison, greeted him with the hollow-eyed expression that had become common among officers responsible for chemical warfare operations. German intelligence indicates they're planning to use their entire stockpile of chemical weapons in a single massive bombardment designed to create a breakthrough before American reinforcements can affect the tactical balance. James studied the intelligence reports, noting the scale of chemical warfare being planned by both sides. The final battle would involve more poison gas than had been used in all previous operations combined, creating contamination that would persist for years after the fighting ended. What are our deployment plans for the Lewisite shells? Saturation bombardment of German staging areas designed to create casualties among troops being positioned for their final assault. We estimate the Lewisite will be 20 times more effective than conventional chemical weapons, potentially eliminating entire divisions before they can reach our front lines. James felt a familiar chill as he processed the implications. He was about to oversee the deployment of weapons that could kill tens of thousands of men in a matter of hours, using scientific knowledge that had been perverted into instruments of mass destruction. The artillery preparation began at dawn on September 12, 1918, with British guns firing the first Lewisite shells ever used in combat. James watched through binoculars as the shells burst over German positions, releasing invisible clouds of death that settled onto troops who had no protection against this new chemical horror. The effectiveness was immediate and terrifying. German soldiers in the targeted areas began collapsing within minutes, their bodies convulsing as organoarsenic compounds attacked their nervous systems with devastating efficiency. Unlike previous chemical weapons that killed through respiratory damage, Lewisite attacked multiple organ systems simultaneously, causing death that was both rapid and agonizing. Magnificent results, the artillery commander reported with professional satisfaction. Estimated German casualties in excess of 5,000 within the first hour. Enemy resistance in the targeted area has ceased completely. James documented the Lewisite attack with scientific precision, recording casualty estimates and tactical effectiveness while trying to maintain emotional distance from the human cost. Through his binoculars, he could see German soldiers fleeing contaminated positions, many falling before they could escape the poison clouds that drifted through their staging areas. But what disturbed him most was the realization that Lewisite represented only the beginning of chemical weapons development. Laboratory research had identified compounds that were even more lethal, delivery systems that could contaminate entire regions, and targeting methods that could make poison gas attacks impossible to survive regardless of protective equipment. The German retaliation came 6 hours later, using their own experimental chemical weapons in concentrations that exceeded anything previously deployed. The bombardment targeted Allied medical facilities, communication centers, and supply depots with surgical precision, creating casualties that overwhelmed every available treatment facility. Sir, a medical corps runner arrived at James's observation post with reports that challenged his understanding of chemical warfare's limits. German gas attacks have created over 8,000 casualties in the past 4 hours. Field hospitals are refusing additional patients, and we're running out of morphine to ease their suffering. James found himself facing the ultimate consequences of the chemical arms race he had helped accelerate. Both sides possessed weapons that could poison entire armies, but neither had developed medical capabilities adequate to treat the casualties such weapons created. The result was systematic torture on a scale that defied human comprehension. That night, as James compiled intelligence reports on chemical weapons effectiveness, he received news that would forever change his understanding of warfare's moral boundaries. A coded message from British intelligence reported that German forces had used experimental nerve agents against civilian populations in Belgium, creating casualties that numbered in the thousands and included large numbers of children. The message included photographs that James wished he could forget, images of entire families who had died together, their faces showing the peaceful expressions characteristic of nerve agent poisoning, but their bodies arranged in positions that suggested they had been trying to protect each other during their final moments. James, Colonel Morrison found him staring at the photographs in his quarters. "I know these images are disturbing, but you must understand that this is what we're fighting against. German willingness to use chemical weapons against civilians justifies any measures we take to defeat them. Does it? At what point does fighting monsters require us to become monsters ourselves? These weapons we've developed, Lewisite, nerve agents, compounds that could poison entire cities, what happens to them after the war ends?" Morrison was silent for a long moment before responding. "I don't know, James. I suppose that's a question for peacetime politicians and international lawyers. Our responsibility is to win this war using whatever tools are available." But James was no longer certain that victory achieved through chemical warfare could be worth its cost. The weapons he had helped develop would exist after the fighting ended, and the knowledge required to produce them would remain in the minds of scientists and military planners who had learned to think of mass poisoning as a legitimate military strategy. The final phase of chemical warfare came on November 9, 1918, 2 days before the armistice would end the fighting. German forces launched their ultimate chemical attack, using every remaining poison gas shell in a desperate attempt to break Allied lines before negotiations could conclude. James watched the bombardment from an observation bunker, seeing the Western Front disappear beneath clouds of gas that represented the cumulative knowledge of 3 years' chemical weapons development. Chlorine, phosgene, mustard gas, Lewisite, and experimental compounds that had no names, all deployed simultaneously in concentrations that turned the battlefield into a chemical wasteland. The human cost was staggering beyond calculation. Allied casualties from the final gas attack exceeded 15,000 men, while German forces suffered similar losses from their own weapons as wind conditions shifted and carried poison clouds back toward their positions. It was chemical warfare consuming its own creators, a technological horror that recognized no boundaries between friend and enemy. When the guns finally fell silent on November 11, 1918, James found himself standing in a landscape that bore little resemblance to the French countryside where he had begun his military service. The ground was contaminated with chemical residues that would remain lethal for years. The water was poisoned, and the air still carried traces of compounds that could kill with each breath. "It's over," Colonel Morrison announced to the assembled staff officers, though his voice carried no note of triumph. "The armistice has been signed. The war is finished." But James knew the war was not finished, merely suspended. The chemical weapons they had developed would outlive the conflict that created them, and the knowledge required to produce even more lethal compounds would remain available to future governments facing military crises. In the months that followed, as James supervised the disposal of chemical weapon stockpiles and documented the medical consequences of gas warfare, he received a letter that crystallized his understanding of what they had accomplished during 4 years of industrial warfare. The letter was from Dr. Heinrich Klossmann, the German chemist he had encountered as a prisoner of war. Klossmann had survived the fighting and was now working with international relief organizations to treat chemical weapons casualties and clean up contaminated areas. "My dear Crawford," the letter read, "the war has ended, but its chemical legacy will persist for decades. We have created weapons that poisoned not just soldiers, but the earth itself, the water, the air that future generations will breathe. I fear that our scientific expertise, applied to military purposes, has opened pathways to destruction that humanity is not wise enough to avoid. I have spent the past months treating gas casualties in German hospitals, watching men die slowly from chemical burns that were inflicted by weapons I helped design. Each death reminds me that we scientists bear moral responsibility for the tools we create, regardless of the political circumstances that prompted their development. Perhaps future generations will be wiser than we were. Perhaps they will recognize that some scientific knowledge is too dangerous to apply, that some military advantages are too costly to pursue. But I fear they will instead perfect the weapons we began, creating compounds that could poison entire nations with industrial efficiency. Your friend and colleague in the strange brotherhood of chemical warriors, Heinrich Klossmann." James folded the letter carefully, adding it to the growing collection of correspondence from scientists and soldiers whose lives had been shaped by chemical warfare. Each letter reinforced his growing conviction that they had created not just weapons, but a new category of human knowledge that challenged civilization's capacity for moral restraint. The final accounting of chemical weapons casualties would not be completed for years after the armistice, but estimates suggested that over 100,000 men had died from gas poisoning, while hundreds of thousands more carried permanent injuries that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Entire regions of France and Belgium remained uninhabitable due to chemical contamination, their soils poisoned by compounds that would persist for decades. But perhaps most significantly, chemical warfare had corrupted the men who developed and deployed it, turning university-educated scientists into professional poisoners and transforming medical knowledge into instruments of mass destruction. James found himself part of a generation that had learned to think of human extermination in industrial terms, applying scientific method to the problem of killing efficiently and extensively. As 1919 dawned and James prepared to return to civilian life, he received one final assignment that would define his understanding of chemical warfare's legacy. He was asked to brief British government officials on future chemical weapons development, providing assessments of what scientific advances might make possible in future conflicts. "Gentlemen," James addressed a committee of politicians and military planners who had never smelled poison gas or watched men die from chemical burns, "the chemical weapons we developed during the war represent only the beginning of what scientific research could make possible. Given adequate funding and laboratory facilities, chemists could develop compounds that are thousands of times more lethal than anything used during the fighting. The committee members leaned forward with interest, apparently viewing chemical weapons as promising tools for future military operations rather than horrors to be avoided. What would be required for such development? The committee chairman asked. James paused, considering his response carefully. He could provide technical details that would accelerate British chemical weapons research, contributing to an arms race that might eventually create weapons capable of poisoning entire populations. Or he could use his expertise to argue against developments that he had come to view as threats to human civilization. Sir, the technical capabilities exist to create chemical weapons that could eliminate entire armies or cities within hours of deployment. But the question we must ask is not whether such weapons can be developed, but whether any nation should develop them. Chemical warfare during the recent conflict demonstrated that poison gas is essentially uncontrollable. It kills indiscriminately, contaminates vast areas for extended periods, and creates casualties that consume medical resources far beyond their military value. The committee chairman seemed disappointed by James's assessment, but surely there are circumstances where chemical weapons might prove decisive in protecting British interests. There are circumstances where chemical weapons could eliminate Britain's enemies, James replied carefully, but there are also circumstances where such weapons could eliminate Britain itself. The knowledge required to produce poison gas cannot be kept secret indefinitely, and any compounds we develop will eventually be available to our enemies as well. The briefing concluded without the enthusiastic endorsement of chemical weapons research that the committee had apparently expected. James left the meeting knowing he had probably ended any possibility of future government employment, but convinced that some forms of scientific knowledge required moral constraints rather than unlimited development. In the years that followed, as James attempted to resume academic life at Cambridge, he would often reflect on the choices that had transformed him from a literature lecturer into a developer of weapons of mass destruction. The war had demonstrated that scientific expertise, divorced from moral consideration, could create capabilities that exceeded human wisdom to control them. The chemical weapons he had helped develop remained in military stockpiles around the world, awaiting future conflicts that might provide justification for their use. The scientific knowledge required to produce even more lethal compounds remained in the minds of chemists who had learned to think of mass poisoning as a legitimate tool of statecraft. But perhaps most troubling was the realization that chemical warfare had established precedents that future generations might follow, creating an escalating spiral of scientific applications to military problems that could ultimately threaten civilization itself. James Crawford had entered the war as an idealistic volunteer who believed in the civilizing influence of scientific progress. He emerged as a man who understood that knowledge, without conscience, could become the enemy of the humanity it was supposed to serve. The silent killer had found its voice during the Great War, and its whispers would echo through decades of future conflict, carried by men who had learned that the greatest horrors were often created by the most educated minds. The laboratories had fallen silent, but the legacy of chemical warfare would endure, waiting for the next crisis to justify its resurrection. And when that time came, humanity would face weapons that made the horrors of the Western Front seem merciful by comparison, created by scientists who had forgotten the lessons that James Crawford had learned in the poison fields of France. That some knowledge is too dangerous to pursue, and some victories are too costly to achieve.